December 1, 1991 remains a day etched in Ukrainian memory. At that moment, 92.3% of Ukrainians who went to vote said yeses to independence, including a majority, though more modest in Crimea and the eastern provinces. This vote, which completes the dissolution of the USSR, marks the official birth of a free state. But this apparent triumph hides older tensions. For Moscow, Ukraine remains an essential piece of an imperial heritage. For many Ukrainians, it's above all the cry of a shattered nation, rebuilt in the ruins of totalitarianism. In this video, we will unravel these crossed visions, imperial and traumatic, to understand why a frozen conflict finally erupts in 2022, trapping two peoples and millions of men, women, and children in a battle of unprecedented geopolitical and human dimensions. Ready to go back in time to lift the veil of the present and see the shadows of the past. Let's go. Let's go back to the origins. To understand today's war, we must dive into a past over 1,000 years old, where myths and rival memories intertwine. We are in the 9th century. On the banks of the Dnieper, a principality rises, the Kievan Rus. Kiev then becomes a vibrant crossroads, linking the Baltic Sea to the splendor of Byzantium. Here merchants, soldiers, and priests weave ties between the north and the east, giving birth to a unique culture. At the end of the 10th century, a decisive turning point occurs. The Grand Prince Vladimir chooses Christian baptism, unifying his people under the aegis of orthodoxy. This choice durably links the Ruses to the Byzantine world and marks the spiritual birth of the Eastern Slavic nations. Under the reign of Yaroslav the Wise, Kiev shines. The St. Sophia Cathedral is built there. Alliances are forged with European courts. Yaroslav's daughter marries the King of France, Henry I. This era forges a common memory, celebrated in the Bylini, these oral epics where the bogatirs, chivalrous heroes, defend the Slavic land against invaders. But this splendor does not last. 1240, Kiev is razed by the Mongols. The Rus fragments, leaving the field open to other powers, Poland, Lithuania in the west, Muscovy in the east. The common cradle shatters into pieces. In the 17th century, the Zaporozhian Cossacks emerge, fierce warriors of the steppes. They embody peasant freedom and resistance against empires. Their leader, the hetman, directs a semi-autonomous state recognized by Moscow, but gradually the Tsar reduces this autonomy. In 1764, the hetmanate disappears, swallowed by the Russian Empire. Under Peter the Great and then Catherine II, Ukraine is fully integrated. The region becomes a strategic asset, breadbasket, military bastion against the Ottomans and Poles. In the cities, the Magdeburg Law, a Polish-Lithuanian vestige, continues for a time to guarantee autonomous municipal life. But the Tsar's centralizing appetite asserts itself, especially toward the elites. Two visions emerge. Russian vision, the Kievan Rus, is seen as the cradle of Russia, a sacred origin. For Vladimir Putin, Ukraine is not a distinct country, but a lost Troy, a land separated from its historical body that must be brought back into the common fold. Ukrainian vision, for Ukrainians, this same Ruses is the matrix of a distinct identity, forged in pain, resistance to the Mongols, Poles, and Tsars. The Zaporozhian Cossacks become symbols of freedom and insubordination, a linguistic paradox. Even today, Russians and Ukrainians share 70 to 75% of their vocabulary, like very close cousins. But the differences are revealing. Spasibo, to say thank you in Russian, Dyakuyu in Ukrainian, a word from Polish. These linguistic divergences, added to centuries of domination and revolts, nourish an identity neither entirely sister nor entirely rival, an invisible but burning border. Soviet Ukraine is born in 1922. When the Soviet Union comes into being, Ukraine becomes one of the 4 founding republics. Officially, it's a federation of equal peoples. In reality, power is concentrated in Moscow, and local decisions are only distant echoes of the Red Capital. Ukraine is a strategic jewel for the young Soviet state. Its black earths, the most fertile in the world, are the promise of abundance and the source of future tensions. 1929. Stalin takes command. He wants to transform the USSR into an industrial power at a forced march. Ukrainian lands become a brutal laboratory for his ambitions. Collectivization begins. Small peasant farms are dissolved. Farms are grouped into kolkhozes, state properties. Many peasants resist. They hide grains, refuse to obey. The regime's response is ruthless. Requisitions, impossible quotas, collective punishment. 1932-1933, the Holodomor. Famine. Entire villages emptied of life. Grain is seized to feed industrial cities and finance exports, while in the Ukrainian countryside, people die of hunger. Millions disappear in a few months. Families reduced to eating bark, animals, then nothing. Testimonies speak of absolute silence, interrupted only by the creaking of funeral carts. According to estimates, 3.5 to 5 million dead. For Ukrainians, this famine is a deliberate genocide, a will to crush the peasantry and break the national spirit. For Moscow, it's a tragedy shared by the entire USSR, an unintended consequence of accelerated modernization. Then comes the war. In 1944, the Soviets retake Crimea from the Nazis. But a new tragedy strikes. In May, nearly 200,000 Crimean Tatars are crammed into cattle cars and deported to Central Asia. Official reason, collaboration with the enemy. In reality, it's collective punishment. Almost half of the deportees die in the first years of exile. Their absence changes the peninsula's demographics. Russians and Ukrainians are settled in their place, preparing future tensions. 1954. The gesture that would become explosive. Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Communist Party and himself of Ukrainian origin, signs a decree administratively attaching Crimea to the Ukrainian Republic. At the time, it's a purely internal decision. In a USSR without real borders, this transfer raises no controversy. But after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses, this gesture becomes a burning issue, a scar inherited from the past. In 1954, Ukraine is thus fully integrated into the USSR, but beneath the surface, the wounds remain gaping, the memory of famines, deportations, repressions. Wounds that time does not erase, and which will reappear at the fall of communism. December 1st, 1991. The country holds its breath. After decades under Soviet yoke, Ukrainians go to the polls to decide their fate. When the results come in, it's a landslide, 92.3% vote for independence. Even in the Russophone East, even in Crimea, the majority says yes. That day, Ukraine is officially born as a sovereign state. The whole world recognizes it. For many, it's the promise of a new, free, and prosperous future. But reality is more complex. The economy remains closely tied to Moscow. Ukraine depends on 60% Russian gas to heat itself, to run its factories. This gas, sometimes subsidized, becomes a weapon of influence in the Kremlin's hands. In 1994, a historic moment occurs, the Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine, which had inherited the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, agrees to return all its warheads to Russia. In exchange, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom commit to respecting its borders and independence. On paper, it's a security guarantee. In fact, it's just a political promise, without a concrete defense mechanism. 2004, the Orange Revolution. Presidential elections marred by serious irregularities shake the country. Viktor Yanukovych, backed by Moscow, is declared the winner. But in the streets, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians contest this result. Kiev is covered in a sea of orange flags, symbol of the opposition. After weeks of peaceful demonstrations, the Supreme Court annuls the vote. A new election is organized. This time, Viktor Yushchenko wins, supported by the West. Two visions clash. Russian side, Moscow sees the Orange Revolution as a Western coup, financed by the United States to tear Ukraine from its influence and draw it toward NATO. Ukrainian side, for the protesters, it's a democratic triumph, a victory of the people against corruption and fraud. This East-West fracture deepens. In the West, they dream of Europe, reforms, freedoms. In the East, they remain turned toward Russia, attached to historical and economic ties. 2012, a discovery that changes everything. In the Black Sea and in the east of the country, immense gas reserves are discovered, more than 2,000 billion cubic meters, enough to make Ukraine a major energy player. Giants like ExxonMobil and Shell sign contracts to exploit these deposits, representing billions of dollars. For Ukraine, it's a dream, energy independence, the end of dependence on Russian gas. But for Moscow, it's a direct threat. If Ukraine becomes an autonomous supplier, it escapes the Kremlin's control. This dream will be shattered as early as 2014, when the crisis erupts and these projects are frozen. History accelerates. Tensions, long contained, are on the verge of exploding. In a few months, Ukraine will go from democratic contestation to open war. Winter 2013, Kiev. Ukraine is preparing to sign a historic agreement with the European Union, but at the last minute, President Viktor Yanukovych, re-elected 3 years earlier, does an about-face. Under pressure from Moscow, he renounces the agreement and instead accepts a Russian loan of $15 billion, accompanied by discounted gas deliveries. For many Ukrainians, it's a betrayal, a sign that the country remains prisoner to Russian influence. November 2013, anger erupts. On Maidan Square, in the heart of Kiev, peaceful demonstrations begin. They gather students, families, workers, all demanding 3 things: European integration, an end to corruption, and dignity for their country. Week after week, the crowd grows. The power responds with repression. In February 2014, violence reaches its peak. Nearly 100 protesters are killed during clashes with the police. Yanukovych flees to Russia. Parliament dismisses him and forms a provisional government, turned toward the West. March 2014, Crimea flips. Just days after Yanukovych's fall, men in green uniforms appear in the streets of Crimea, without flags, without insignia. These are the famous little green men, Russian soldiers deployed secretly. In a few days, strategic buildings are occupied. The Ukrainian army, disorganized, offers almost no resistance. On March 16th, a referendum is organized under military control. Official result, 96.8% for attachment to Russia. For Moscow, it's a historic reunification, a return to the motherland. For Kiev and the West, it's an illegal annexation, a flagrant violation of international law and the Budapest guarantees of 1994. This takeover galvanizes pro-Russian movements elsewhere in Ukraine. It also triggers an immediate reaction from Kiev, such as the blocking of the North Crimean Canal, which supplied the peninsula with fresh water. From then on, the conflict is no longer just political, it becomes territorial and military. April 2014, the Donbas ignites. In the east, an industrial and 60% Russophone region, anti-Maidan demonstrations degenerate. Armed groups seize official buildings and proclaim the creation of the People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. Behind them, the shadow of Moscow, logistical support, weapons, disinformation, but without declared direct intervention. Thus begins a hybrid war, both military and political. The borders between war and peace blur. In a few months, the toll is already terrible. 14,000 dead between 2014 and 2022, including more than 3,400 civilians. Ukrainian side, about 4,400 dead soldiers and civilians. Separatist and pro-Russian side, about 6,500 dead. Everywhere, civilians are caught in the trap. May 2, 2014, Odessa. Far from the front, in the south, the port city of Odessa is shaken by clashes between pro-Maidan and anti-Maidan. What starts as a demonstration degenerates into street battles. Molotov cocktails fly. A group of pro-Russian militants takes refuge in the House of Trade Unions. Then the horror. A fire breaks out in the building. Some die burned alive. Others jump from windows to escape the flames. Toll, 48 dead, including 42 in the fire. For Moscow, it's proof that Kiev persecutes Russophonies. For Kiev, it's a tragedy born of chaos, an uncontrolled escalation. The UN notes responsibilities on both sides, but no complete investigation has ever been conducted. Odessa becomes a symbol, fueling hatred and propaganda. September 2014, Minsk I. To stop the escalation, negotiations open in Minsk under the auspices of the OSCE, with France and Germany as mediators. Objectives: ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weapons, promise of autonomy for the Donbas. But the agreement is never fully respected. Fighting resumes almost immediately. February 2015, Minsk II. A new attempt is launched. This time, the text is more precise, the commitments more detailed. Yet again, the ceasefire remains fragile. Each side accuses the other of violating the agreements. In the end, Minsk II does not bring peace. It transforms the war into a frozen conflict, a front line frozen over 400 kilometers, marked by daily skirmishes and bombardments. Two irreconcilable visions face off. Russian vision: Maidan is not a revolution, but a coup orchestrated by the United States, justifying the protection of oppressed Russophones in the Donbas. Moscow accuses Kiev of sabotaging Minsk by refusing the promised autonomy. Ukrainian vision: Maidan is a legitimate revolution, a popular uprising against corruption and authoritarianism. For Kiev, the separatists are aggressors armed and financed by Moscow. Minsk is seen as a forced compromise, accepted to buy time against a hybrid invasion. Even after Minsk II, the front line remains an open wound. Even in 2024, the OSCE records nearly 10,000 explosions per day, a sign that the war has never really stopped, a ceasefire in appearance. But in reality, a war in slow motion, preparing the explosion of 2022. After Minsk II, the silence of arms is only an illusion. In appearance, the Donbas war freezes. A front line of 400 kilometers divides eastern Ukraine. But beneath the surface, the conflict continues to simmer. Every day, skirmishes erupt. Isolated shots, explosions. Not enough to restart a total war, but enough to remind everyone that peace is just a word. In parallel, another battle is waged, that of gas. Since the 2000s, Ukraine depends on Russian gas to heat its cities and power its industries. Moscow turns it into a political weapon. 2006. Russia cuts supplies for 18 days. 2009. Another cut, this time 20 days, paralyzing Europe in the middle of winter. Each crisis plunges millions of households into cold and fear. Until 2018, these tensions remain recurrent. Then Kiev diversifies its imports, gradually reducing its dependence on Moscow. But mistrust never disappears. 2021. Tension rises a notch. In spring, more than 100,000 Russian soldiers mass at Ukraine's borders. According to NATO, it's the largest concentration of troops since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. On the Donbas contact line, violence resumes. In a few weeks, about 50 Ukrainian soldiers are killed, the worst toll since 2018. Then, in April, Moscow announces a partial withdrawal. Tension drops for a moment, but sporadic shots continue, like a fever that never completely subsides. Two visions oppose each other. Russian vision: for Moscow, these deployments are a defensive measure. NATO's expansion since 1991, integrating Poland, the Baltic states, and other neighbors, is perceived as an existential threat. Ukraine, supported by the West, becomes the red line not to cross. Massing troops is, according to the Kremlin, protecting its vital interests before it's too late. Ukrainian vision. In Kiev, these troop movements are just intimidation. For Ukraine, they are flagrant violations of the Minsk agreements and the Budapest guarantees of 1994, meant to protect its borders. Russia, by maintaining constant pressure, seeks to test Kiev's resistance and maintain its grip on the Donbas. A little-known point of tension, Crimea's water. After the annexation of the peninsula in 2014, Ukraine blocks the North Crimean Canal, which supplied 85% of the fresh water used for agriculture and domestic supply. The consequences are dramatic. Drinking water shortages, dried up fields, agricultural losses estimated at $200 million per year until 2023. Moscow sees it as a cruel punishment inflicted on Russophone civilians. For Kiev, on the contrary, it's a strategic lever, a response to the illegal annexation of Crimea. Not an attack on civilians, but a way to expose Russian vulnerability and force negotiations. Thus, between 2015 and 2021, nothing is really resolved. The front remains frozen, grudges accumulate, armies prepare. A landscape of tense waiting, like cracked earth before the storm. The 2022 invasion will not be a sudden thunderclap, but the culmination of years of inexorable tensions. At the heart of the conflict, two men and two worldviews. Vladimir Putin, in power since 1999, embodies the continuity of a Russian state that sees itself as the heir to an empire. For him, Ukraine is not a foreign country, but an integral part of Russian history. On February 24, 2022, he launches the offensive with a solemn speech. He speaks of denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine, and describes it as an artificial state, created by Lenin, then exploited by the West to encircle Russia. Opposite him, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, a former comedian who became president in 2019 with 73% of the votes, he comes to power carried by a promise to bring peace and reconcile a country fractured by the Donbas war. When the invasion begins, he chooses to stay in Kiev. His response is immediate and unambiguous: "We will not surrender." For Zelenskyy, what is at stake is not a simple border war, but the survival of an independent nation born from the 1991 referendum. The Russian vision. In a long essay published in 2021, Putin develops his thought: Russians and Ukrainians would be one and the same people, artificially separated by the collapse of the USSR, which he calls a geopolitical catastrophe. According to Moscow, the 2022 invasion is preventive. It aims to protect the Russophone populations of the Donbas, whom the Kremlin accuses Kiev of having bombarded and persecuted, and Russia itself, in the face of NATO's continuous expansion eastward, perceived as an existential threat. Moscow claims that the Minsk agreements were sabotaged by Kiev, which allegedly refused to grant the promised autonomy to the separatist regions and continued military operations against them. The Kremlin also insists on the presence of ultra-nationalist and neo-Nazi movements in Ukraine, such as the Azov Regiment or the Right Sector movement. These groups, although minority in society, have played an important role in some battles since 2014. For Moscow, they symbolize a direct threat to Russophones, and their existence justifies the proclaimed goal of denazification, a more complex reality on the ground. Since 2014, Ukraine has been waging a defensive war where every fighter counts. In this context, the government has made a pragmatic, even cynical choice to accept volunteers from extremist movements into its ranks, not out of ideological adherence, but out of military necessity in the urgency of war. For Kiev, it's a simple logic of survival. Anyone who wants to defend the country is welcome, regardless of their political convictions. For Moscow, this simple fact takes on a whole other dimension. In the Russian imagination, it directly refers to the Great Patriotic War, the fight against Nazi Germany between 1941 and 1945. Seeing Nazi symbols, even worn by a minority of Ukrainian fighters, awakens a deep collective trauma. This memory nourishes Kremlin propaganda and allows it to present the war as a crusade against fascism, an echo of a founding victory for modern Russian identity. The Ukrainian vision. For Kiev, the war is an imperialist aggression, an attempt to destroy the Ukrainian state and re-establish Russian domination. Ukraine recalls that Moscow has violated the Minsk agreements by militarily supporting the separatists and refusing to let Kiev regain control of its own borders. It accuses Russia of multiplying shipments of weapons, funds, and volunteers to the Donbas, while denying its direct involvement. Kiev also invokes the violation of the Budapest Memorandum, 1994, by which Ukraine had renounced its nuclear arsenal in exchange for a promise to respect its borders, signed by Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Regarding the far right, the Ukrainian government acknowledges the existence of these radical groups, but insists on their limited electoral weight, around 2 to 5% depending on the elections. For Kiev, these organizations control neither the state nor the army, even if their fighters have been integrated by necessity into certain units since 2014. Zelenskyy himself, from a Jewish family that suffered the Holocaust, presents himself as the guarantor of a democratic and pluralistic Ukraine, distinct from these extreme movements. The failure of Minsk and the rise to extremes. Between 2015 and 2022, the front remains frozen but unstable. Ceasefire violations are constant. The OSCE documents shots coming from both sides, with bombardments and destructions of inhabited areas. Moscow accuses Kiev of attacking separatist areas and blocking the promised autonomy. Kiev accuses Moscow of directly arming and supervising the separatist forces. This vicious circle transforms the frozen front into a latent blaze. When Putin speaks of preventive war against NATO and Zelenskyy invokes the right to self-determination before the UN, these are two totally opposing narratives clashing. Two versions of the same story, each fueled by fear, memory, and propaganda. And between them, millions of civilians caught in the trap. In February 2022, these irreconcilable narratives finally explode. What could have remained a frozen conflict transforms into open war, drawing Europe and the world into a major geopolitical crisis. In conclusion, this war plunges its roots into a long and tormented history. Imperial roots going back to the Kievan Ruses and the rivalries of the Tsarist, Polish-Lithuanian, and Ottoman empires. Traumatic roots, forged in famines, deportations, and the upheavals of the 20th century. Two memories. Two narratives, two worldviews. For Russia, it's the idea of a preventive reunification, the conviction that a separated people must be reunited to survive in a hostile world. For Ukraine, it's the defense of an inalienable sovereignty, won at the price of blood and the independence of 1991, against what is experienced as aggression. This war is complex. Its causes are multiple, geopolitical, energetic, identitary, memorial. We are far from the Manichaean narrative often proposed by the media, whether Russian, Ukrainian, or Western. Each side, through propaganda or conviction, blackens the other to whitewash itself. Here, our goal is not to choose a side, but to offer a more nuanced map, to illuminate the gray area between black and white, to allow you, curious subscribers, to form your own opinion. In 2025, the stalemate is total. According to the CSIS, the conflict has already caused nearly 1 million cumulative losses, soldiers and civilians combined. But the figures themselves are a battlefield. Kiev speaks of 46,000 Ukrainian dead and 98,000 Russian Zelenskyy's figures, December 2024. Moscow, on its side, drastically minimizes 6,000 Russian dead only according to its Ministry of Defense. Between these extremes, the truth remains uncertain. But one thing is sure, the war bleeds both sides, and Ukrainian conscription extends to ever younger recruits, a sign of crushing demographic pressure. The front, meanwhile, remains frozen, a line of fire where pretexts and retaliations chain together, trapping millions of lives in a cycle without a clear winner. And tomorrow, a few scenarios circulate among analysts: an American disengagement, which would paralyze NATO and open the way to a Russian victory; a frozen agreement like the two Koreas, which freezes the lines to Moscow's benefit; a political upheaval in Russia, where a new power would choose withdrawal and a return to the borders provided by Minsk II. These hypotheses remain speculative, but they remind us that peace will come, if it comes, not from a single event, but from the fragile meeting between diplomacy, domestic politics, and collective memory. In the meantime, our responsibility is vigilance. Understand before judging. Listen before concluding. It is in this spirit that we offer you this analysis, not to tell you what to think, but to give you the keys to think for yourselves. Thank you for sharing this quest for nuances with us. See you soon for a new journey into history, far from slogans and as close as possible to human realities.